the polls in 2016 and 2020 both underpredicted Trump's success. So the question is why? Was the same mistake made twice? Were different mistakes made? Or is there some third explanation?
Yeah, I think it's worth decomposing what happened into two different stories. In 2016, the national polls were not particularly wrong. I think the final average was 3.4 and the final result was 2.2 in margin. So not terribly different. But on a state level, the reason why Trump's win was a surprise was because basically all of these states in the Midwest saw these giant swings toward Donald Trump that the polling didn't see coming. And, I guess not just in the Midwest, really, if you look state by state, the biggest predictor is that states that had a lot of non-college educated whites, but particularly in the Midwest, or at least particularly outside the South, saw very big polling errors. But the national numbers were about right. And so in 2018, the national numbers were also about right, but the same polling errors actually occurred again. If you look, Democrats really underperformed expectations in these working class white states like Ohio or Michigan or West Virginia is the most extreme one. And then we flash forward to 2020, and this exact same set of biases happen again. People make these plots, and you can just see that really the polls were wrong in relative terms in basically exactly the same places for 3 cycles in a row. But there was another phenomena that did happen, which is that in 2020, the national polls were not just about right. The national polls were pretty wrong by historical standards. It looks like we're going to end up, with something like a Biden plus 4.5, maybe 5-point race in the national popular vote once all the votes are tallied. And that is not what the average, what the national polling average was. You can see this pretty down the line, not just in the presidency, but in the Senate and the House, where everything was roughly 2 to 3% more Republican than everyone predicted in a relatively uniform way. A little bit more in Republican states, but fairly uniform. And so you had these two things happening simultaneously, and they had a similar, but some they were two different phenomena with two different causes, but I think that in a lot of ways they come from the same phenomena. And just to talk about that, when people talk about polling error, I think people misfocus on what actually makes polls wrong. People really like to talk about turnout. They like to talk about undecided voters. They like to talk about, what we call in the industry late movement. The polls were wrong because everybody changed their mind at the last second. Or the undecideds broke our way, or, one side really mobilized their base and the other side didn't. And that's actually usually not why polls are wrong. All of those things are possible. Oh, and I forgot. Also, people have this shy Trump hypothesis that people are lying to pollsters. As far as we can tell, that's actually a very rare thing. It usually does not happen.
That's actually worth dwelling on for a second, because I've heard a lot of people believe that. So before you continue, what's the evidence that that's actually not the case?
There's a couple of pieces. The first is that, we can, one thing people like to do for this is they to get at this social desirability is they look at, are there differences between how people answer online versus on the phone? We can re-interview people multiple times and see how consistent they are. And then the other thing is that we can match survey respondents to the voter file. And something that we can see is that really the vast majority, in the voter file, we have things like party registration, we can see donation records. What we can see is there's a very strong relationship, between what people say and what people end up doing, both in re-interviews and with external information that we have about them. The problem isn't that, Trump voters were lying. The real issue is that they just weren't picking up the phone. And that really gets to this, core problem of why polls are actually usually wrong. It gets to this thing you asked me about, a couple minutes ago, which is that when you call a bunch of people, polling working is built on this idea that the people who answer the phone are the same as the people who don't answer the phone once you control for the things that you wait on. And traditionally, pollsters have really waited, and when I say waited, I mean if you survey a bunch of people and the sample is 70% women because women are more likely to pick up the phone, and from the census that the population is 50% women, you kind of apply a weight to women to weight their responses down, and you weight the men up, and then things represent the overall population. And so basically, if there are things that you aren't weighting on that are influencing someone's chance of picking up the phone, and those things are correlated with who they're going to vote for, then your poll is going to be wrong. And so that's why pollsters do weighting. But historically, they've only weighted on a very small number of factors, age and race and gender. And most recently, after 2016, they started to do education. And the problem with it is it's very hard to know. When you do this process, you simultaneously have to ask people the thing or have the information on the survey respondents, but you also have to know the true value. And that's easier for gender. In the voter file, there's gender, you can do counts, or the census will tell you. But if you want to know, even for education, people with college degrees are more likely to vote than people who aren't. So even if the census tells you that 30% of people have a college degree, it's very hard to know what percentage of likely voters have a college degree. That's like a very hard problem. But as a result, pollsters have weighted on a very small number of things. And most polling error comes from when something is predicting a response that they weren't controlling for. The industry term for this is survey non-response bias. I think people find it a little non-intuitive, when I say this. But the important point is that response rates are very low now. It used to be, going back to the 1940s, that Gallup could call people and you would get an 80% response rate. And I think that's because the world was a lot more boring back then. So someone could, people would get a call and they go, oh my God, a researcher wants to know my views on contemporary events. And the world isn't like that anymore. Now, going into 2016, which was, the last year that, my former employer did phone calls, we were looking at 0.8% response rates. And so if you're in a world where Democrats are picking up the phone at 1.4% and Republicans are picking up at 1.1, that'll actually generate a very significant bias that'll be very hard to control for.